As mentioned in the last lecture, the practice of child labor during the Industrial Revolution was abundantly common. Along with child labor's commonality, it was also common during the 19th and 20th centuries for child laborers to strike against the conditions of their work. As Caroline Trinkley states in her article, Child Labor in America, an Historical Analysis, it is, quote, time for the myth of the child as a passive actor in his or her employment to be retired. Children actively participated in union activity, both on their own and with adults, end quote. In this lecture, we will discuss other groups of child laborers who striked like the Newsies, how child labor was reformed to establish federal law, while the newsboys were still struggling despite these laws, and lastly, how child labor is still a very real aspect of our contemporary America. We're starting off with the ladies this time, specifically young women who became known as either bobbin girls, doffers, or low girls throughout the 1830s and 40s. All of these names were used to refer to the women who, according to Bartoletti, were, quote, young teenagers or unmarried women between the ages of 15 and 25, often the daughters of Yankee farmers. They moved from surrounding farms and villages to factory towns like Lao, end quote, in order to work in these mills. As with the Newsies, at first, there was no problem surrounding their work or conditions of living. However, with the growing demand for textiles and competition between various mills, the owners of the mills lowered the prices and thus lowered profits. Bartoletti writes that in 1834, when the mill owners announced a cut in wages, the mill girls organized. They gave 2 weeks quitting notice and withdrew their savings from the banks, end quote. When the mill girls reacted by firing one of the leaders of the strike, when the mill owners reacted by firing one of the leaders, 800 other mill girls turned out or left the mills behind her. This particular strike was unsuccessful. The mill girls' activism spanned through many strikes to have their rights heard. The girls established the Factory Girls Association and walked out of the mills during the 1836 Laos strike. However, in the end, these girls eventually either returned to work at the set wages or went back home, since they were evicted from the boarding houses that they were allowed to live in if they had moved to seek out work. Mills continued to pop up around in the Northeast, and women of various ages attempted to strike in similar ways throughout the 1800s and 1900s. One last point I want to make about these women laborers is that Bartoletti writes in her book that, quote, they marched through the streets singing songs to raise their spirits and morale. They wrote their own words to popular tunes, end quote. Keep that in mind in the upcoming sections when we talk specifically about Disney's depictions of the Newsboys' strike of 1899. Let's shift gears and jump a few years ahead to a child-led strike that occurs basically simultaneously along the Newsboys' strike. In July of 1899, the New York Messenger Boys, that is, the boys who delivered messages and memos rather than selling papers on the streets, went on strike regarding their working conditions as opposed to wages, just like the mill girls and the Newsies. While Newsies knew a paper was going out daily, the Messenger Boys lacked a sense of predictability regarding hours or just work in general. Fees were also applied on the Messenger Boy uniform that was disliked because of how frequently the attire was required to be purchased, even if a new piece wasn't necessary. So what did the boys ask for before striking? Bartoletti claims that they wanted to be paid for all the telegrams that they gained possession of, regardless of if the recipient was not found. At the time, the boys were only paid for the telegrams that were delivered and received by the recipient. Refusing to listen, the boys boycotted, declaring their strike in the New York Sun on July 22nd. If you'll recall, at this point, the Newsies were currently striking. This can also cause us to wonder, did the Messenger Boys choose to declare their strike in the Sun because they knew circulation was low in the world in the journal. We know that they utilized similar tactics to the boys, especially in regard to soaking scabs. What they lacked in comparison to the Newsies was substantial leadership. I wasn't pulling your leg when I said that the Newsies had a good system and that the communication aspect really mattered. Bartoletti claims that this tactic was difficult to develop considering there were too many boys working for too many different companies. While the Newsies lasted 2 weeks, the messenger boys only lasted until July 27th. The boot blacks, aka shoe shiners, that worked on the streets alongside the messenger boys and the Newsies also striked in 1899. The cause of their strike was the installed cash registers, which the boys believed insinuated that they were dishonest in their work. The boys claimed, according to Bartoletti, that the registers and bell systems were, quote, degrading because it made monkeys out of them, end quote. Their conditions to return to work was really an ultimatum: loss of the registers or increase in the bootblacks' wages by $2. Refusal resulted in throwing their stands into the water. Basically, they were going to throw them off the edge of the ferries. They were heard, and like the Newsies, they were only given a compromise. Instead of the $2 raise, they settled for $1 raise. The Lau girls represent the child labor occurring in factories and mills. The Newsies, messenger boys, and bootblacks represent the child labor in the street trade work. The last example of child labor strike I want to talk about takes place in the coal mines. According to Michael Bergen in his book Breaker Boys: How a Photograph Helped End Child Labor, throughout Pennsylvania in the 1800s and 1900s, anthracite coal was dug by miners for market sale. However, in the breakers, which were large buildings located on the collieries, young boys known as breaker boys worked in these buildings in order to sort through the coal by hand. This work was less dangerous than the work of the adult miners. Nevertheless, the boys were consistently breathing in the black, contaminated air surrounding them. As for their striking, it doesn't appear they had any set declared strike that lasted for any significant stretch of time. Instead, the boys participated in what Bartoletti terms wildcat strikes. She writes, quote, "During these strikes, the breaker boys refused to work until their demands were met. At one breaker, for instance, the boys struck when the coal company bosses canceled the annual winter sledding party. The bosses tried to prevent the boys from striking. If a breaker wasn't working, the coal couldn't be produced. A breaker boy strike could shut down the entire colliery operation," end quote. These small wildcat strikes did grow over the years, though. In 1900, a successful strike was led by coal miners, some of which were teenagers, in which wages were raised. The most influential strike, however, took place in 1902. This strike lasted 165 days, and the fear it instilled in the country was a leading cause for the demands to be heard. President Roosevelt, this is President Teddy Roosevelt, intervened and insisted that the operators settle with the miners. Bartoletti writes, quote, "The 1902 strike affected the entire country. Throughout the nation, people feared the severe coal shortage during the winter months. The strike also had a deep impact on the anthracite region as the wages of the mine workers disappeared from the local economy. Merchants, retailers, and wholesale workers lost huge amounts of business," end quote. Ultimately, while these strikes were valuable in changing the conditions of laborers who worked in mines both young and old, the breaker boys played an even larger role of significance in ending child labor. Lewis Wicks Hine was hired by the National Child Labor Committee, the NCLC, which we will discuss more about in a moment, but he was hired to investigate the conditions of child labor throughout the nation on a federal level in order to document what was happening in order for reform to take place. Hine did this through photography, more specifically what is known as social photography. This image, featured on the side, is the photograph Bergen claims helped end child labor. Bergen gives a great analysis of this photo, which states, quote, "The pictures he took," this is Hein, "with the boys like this provided the famous image that seemed to sum up the hard life of the Breaker boys. Their faces are young, but they dress like grown workmen with their jackets and overalls. Coal dust covers some of the faces, and the boys don't smile. They simply stare at the lens of Hein's camera. They show none of the joy most people associate with childhood, a joy progressives thought they deserved." End quote. Bergen goes on discussing the way in which Hein broke down traditional customs, followed by other photographers in which the subject did not look at the camera. Hein rejected this practice, hoping the subject would connect with the viewer in its portrayal of reality. In this way, as Bergen writes, quote, "The image of the Breaker boys covered with coal dust staring so hard helped shape American history." End quote. Let's now turn away from looking directly at the strikes cultivated by and led by child laborers and attempt to track how the practice of child labor came to what many consider an end in America. This practice of utilizing children as laborers is not strictly an American phenomenon. It is and has been common and typical in other nations, especially when undergoing industrialization. However, child labor in the United States was, according to Hugh Heinemann, developed out of a unique, quote, "myriad of industries in specific times and places, particular children, with their own names, identity, and histories," end quote, in which these children's stories could grow into cultural icons, as with the Breaker boys. While the cultural icon of the Breaker boys was effective in breaking down societal acceptance of child labor, another, mythologized icon was effective in normalizing child labor. This icon is the yeoman. As an agricultural labor in the home front, including both and inside the literal home and outside the home on the property, Heinemann calls yeomanry, quote, "the social and economic ideal against which industrial child labor came to be measured," end quote. The frontier beginnings of America continued throughout the Industrial Revolution, only westward, allowing the built-in child labor of yeomanry to continue on as a practice and as a way to reinforce child labor as non-problematic. However, Heinemann claims that this legacy, that the built-up mythologization of the yeoman's self-sufficiency, quote, "has made it difficult to regulate child labor in certain industries and occupations historically to that ideal, especially agriculture," end quote. In other words, agricultural work and other elements of yeomanry is not outside the urban exploitations of child labor. This legacy and believed in notion was a major hurdle to overcome in reforming child labor. What we can refer to as the first type of reform in child labor occurred even prior to our Trade Street youth-led strikes. It actually took place, according to Heinemann, with the abolition of slavery. The role of the slave child was to restock the adult laborers later on in life, so their training and conditioning toward work started at a young age. Heinemann defines the slavery as, quote, "captive labor supply," which allows us to understand the significance of the child laboring slave. He or she was always on the side, a supply to be utilized, some now for maximum use later, under this complete captivity. This is how abolition truly is not only a freedom of adult slaves, but a reform movement that breaks the notion of child labor. Indentured servitude, which is not the same as captive labor supplied through slavery, acted as a type of child labor as well. This system not only was mutually beneficial to the master and the servant, but it acted as an economic benefit of the nation through establishing a child labor market, working as well as working as an immigration policy. Immigrants came to the colonies, and these colonies would eventually become the United States under contracts of indentured servitude. At the same time, the established child labor market dealt with the increasing issue of impoverished children and orphans overseas. The distinction I want to make here between slavery and indentured servitude is under what conditions the practices came to an end. Slavery is abolished, federally mandated and eradicated before a great portion of the country wanted slavery to be abolished. Indentured servitude, however, just fizzles out and is gone by the 1820s. In the battle to end child labor, the federal laws are established as the practice itself is dying, just as it did with indentured servitude. This is why we can think of abolition as the first real reform in child labor, because the federal government mandated it to free people of a still real captivity. It takes 37 years of the 20th century from the establishment of the National Child Labor Committee, the NCLC, in 1904 for federal law to pass protective and constitutional laws prohibiting child labor in the United States. The NCLC begins investigating child labor industries. Lewis Hine is significant in this stage, as he is hired in order to remove public ignorance on the severity of the subject through images and photographs. Another honorable mention here is the written report of Owen Lovejoy, member of the NCLC, which was published in 1905 and describes the breakers and young miners' conditions of work, how they were dangerous and unsafe work environments. In the following year, despite the reformers facing some counter-reformers, a Beveridge child labor bill was proposed but not passed. This bill, which would place a ban on child-produced goods from the interstate commerce, was not passed because President Teddy Roosevelt feared it was unconstitutional. However, Roosevelt did agree to support federal studies of child labor as well as the creation of a federal children's bureau, which would become established in 1912 and join as a part of the U.S. Department of Labor in 1913. The Beveridge Bill undergoes a makeover and becomes the Palmer-Owen Bill, which is renamed after being blocked in the Senate into the Keating-Owen Act in 1916. This act, the Keating-Owen Act, proclaimed that a child must be at least 14 years old to perform industrious work for only 8 hours a day for those workers between the ages of 14 and 16. In other words, if you're between the ages of 14 and 16, you can only work for 8 hours a day. No workers are allowed to do industrious work if they are not 14 years or older. In this law, the child laborers of the street and in forms of agriculture are not mentioned or protected. We'll talk more about how the newsies were neglected and what challenges reformers faced when advocating for newsies in a moment. Continuing to look at this timeline, a Supreme Court case struck down the Keating-Owen Act in 1918. The Child Labor Tax Act came next in 1919, which granted Congress the ability to authorize a 10% excise tax on goods manufactured through child labor. But please, don't get your hopes up. We're only 15 years into this game of cat and mouse, and the Child Labor Tax Act is deemed unconstitutional by 1922. At this point, the NCLC decided to support a constitutional amendment regarding child labor. Their amendment, allowing Congress to limit, regulate, and prohibit the labor of those persons under 18 years old, was not ratified. It isn't until after the Great Depression that child labor is federally considered and impacted again. The National Recovery Administration, or the NRA, established NRA codes, specifically the Cotton Textile Code, which included provisions surrounding child labor. So in the Cotton Textile Code, there was a provision that workers must be 16 years of age, and there were other elements included in these codes regarding how many hours work was max and accessibility to minimum wage. It's important to note, however, that by the 1920s in a post-World War I America, child labor was already beginning to dissipate. This recession of child laborers only increased after the Depression. More and more children were stepping away from working as a result of the Great Depression. Despite this natural shift away from working children, it is also significant that the federal government, through the use of NRA codes, changed the standards on the minimum age from 14 to 16. If we look back at the Keating-Owen Act, everybody was willing, not everybody because it didn't go through, but the majority of people were willing to settle that 14 years of age should be the minimum working age. But in these NRA codes, there is no question to 16 being that new minimum age. And that basically happened overnight, and it is significant. So the next step was the Fair Labor Standards Act, which would restore the NRA codes and touched on the issues reformers had been trying to establish for 32 years: minimum wage, maximum hours, and child labor. But, as stated before, the issue of child labor was in no way the same issue it had been at the turn of the century. Nevertheless, as Hyman points out, quote, "The Fair Labor Standards Act originally exempted agriculture altogether. Numerous exemptions and exceptions enabled child labor to continue to flourish in many of the street trades and permitted child labor to creep back into the sweating sectors of the economy." End quote. That is to say, the Fair Labor Standards Act would be passed by Congress in 1938, and it would be officially ruled constitutional in 1941, 37 years after the NCLC was established, and 41 years after the Newsboys' strike of 1899. But, as Hyman points out in the quote that I just read, this was still not enough. It still isn't enough today. This is what we're about to talk about. How, through this act that is in current law today, it's not enough. It wasn't enough for the newsies, and it's not enough now. It still enables street trade, child labor to be permitted. So, as I mentioned while quoting Hyman at the end of our last slide, this Fair Labor Standards Act didn't exactly protect the newsie, but why not? Let's talk about why the newsies were hard to protect under federal reform. The street trade child labor was ultimately a different kind of beast than the child labor of factories, mills, and mines, because in these places there was a hierarchy where the boss man was on top and the child laborers were on the bottom. Yes, this was the case in the newsies, bootblacks, and messenger workers too. However, the difference is, while there was an employer, there also wasn't one. These child laborers were not isolated to one working place, and their employers were not identifiable because of the unpredictability of their work. When the NCLC took on the task of investigating street trades, they looked towards the newsies. Hyman writes, quote, "The newsboys' problem proved to be especially resistant to effective reform long after the mines, mills, and factories." End quote. This is partially due to, as Hyman describes, 3 factors. 1. The newsie was an ingrained urban figure, meaning that 2, the newsies had, in a sense, always been there. And 3, because the work didn't appear industrial, it was easily overlooked. Reform projects took place, such as badge systems and required work permits for boys over the age of 10, but because children are smart and the newsies had already proved their wit, these provisions were worked around. The main issue was that the laws were aimed at the children rather than at the adults. Without an employer to blame, the child labor occurring on the streets was seemingly impossible to regulate. Hyman brilliantly summarizes this issue when he writes, quote, "Call the little merchants independent businessmen, diminutive business folk, entrepreneurs, self-employed, independent contractors, licensees, franchisees, call them anything but employees." End quote. Because of this refusal to look at a newsboy or a messenger boy or a bootblack and see him as an employee being employed by an employer, the only possible, quote-unquote possible solution to the Newsies problem in child labor was to let it fizzle out, and it did. This is mainly due to post-World War I introduction of the newspaper stands on street corners. Through the use of newspaper stands, Newsies distributing papes was no longer necessary. Before we jump to discussing how the federal laws are not entirely comprehensive in the eradication of child labor, especially regarding street trade, I want to point out one last quote from Hugh Heinemann that we can think about in regards to Newsies, especially in the stage adaptation we're going to talk about in our third section. He writes, quote, "For the rural child, agriculture remained the major unregulated work opportunity. For the urban child, the streets were often the only real alternative." End quote. So, I bet you wouldn't have to think too hard if you wanted to find ways in which child labor is still very much present in our current contemporary day-to-day life. Think of your neighborhood child-managed lemonade stand. Sounds silly, but as Hyman points out, this is legal, and most likely the child is his or her own employer. However, the legality goes even further because street trade provisions aren't as regulated as other forms of child labor under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Hyman asserts, that this child could become, quote, a sales agent for companies peddling greeting cards, end quote. Also sounds silly, but how is this any different from peddling and hawking newspapers? Think of the fundraisers that are utilized by schools, community clubs, and churches. What do these fundraisers do? They send children out onto the streets to sell goods and receive indirect benefits from their labor. On a more serious note, Hyman documents how in many states there are investigations regarding, quote, sham charities that bus inner city children out to the suburbs to scam wealthier residents out of their money, end quote. In some of these cases, the children have been taken across state lines and are forced to work outside of their consent. Another child laborer we should consider is the childhood television and movie star. While this practice is not related to street trade, it is astronomically abundant in the production of entertainment to, as Caroline Trinkley states, quote, enhanced storylines, end quote. On a final note, I would even like to encourage you to think about this topic of child labor, when we look at Disney's production of Newsies, both of them. It is no secret that some of the actors on screen were and are considered children.